Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. A whirlwind of events is unfolding across the globe, impacting economies and political landscapes. Today, we're diving deep into several key developments, from significant shifts in international trade relations involving the European Union and the United States to critical decisions looming for the Federal Reserve concerning interest rates. We'll also touch upon the ongoing influence of figures like Donald Trump on these matters, and analyze the latest data concerning inflation and economic growth. There's a lot to unpack, so stay tuned as we explore these interconnected issues. We'll provide a comprehensive analysis and share our conclusions at the end of this video, so make sure you stick around for the full picture. Before we jump in, if you find this content valuable, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel. Your support is incredibly important for us to continue bringing you these updates and analyses. Also, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our global audience. Let's start with the major news breaking concerning trade tariffs. Ladies and gentlemen, we have some substantial developments regarding the current tariff situation between major global players. The European Union has put forth an offer to the United States aimed at abolishing reciprocal tariffs specifically on industrial goods. This proposal, reported by outlets like Disclosed TV and Watcher, Guru, indicates the EU's readiness to discuss a zero-for-zero tariff arrangement with the US. This development is particularly noteworthy given the context. Just yesterday, and indeed for some time prior, rumors had been circulating, suggesting that the EU was preparing to retaliate against any potential new US tariffs, possibly mirroring the 25% or similar figures seen previously, much like the Canadians did. The expectation was that the EU would immediately counter with reciprocal measures. However, within a mere 12 hours of those anticipated tariffs potentially being announced or becoming imminent, the EU has seemingly pivoted, expressing a willingness to negotiate the elimination of these specific industrial tariffs altogether. This sudden shift suggests a complex interplay of economic pressures and strategic calculations. It's a significant move, potentially altering the trade dynamics that have been shaped by recent tariff implementations. We need to consider why this offer is being made now. Is it a genuine attempt at de-escalation, or is it a strategic maneuver anticipating other economic shifts? The impact on various industries, from automotive to manufacturing, could be profound if such an agreement materializes. This isn't happening in a vacuum, of course. Numerous other nations, including Vietnam, Israel, and India, have also reportedly expressed similar sentiments, seeking smoother trade terms. Even China, despite the ongoing tensions and significant tariffs already imposed by the US under the Trump administration and continued scrutiny, would logically seek negotiations, although the political landscape makes that particular scenario highly complex. The desire for zero-for-zero tariffs seems to be gaining traction globally, reflecting a broader pushback against protectionist measures, or perhaps a realization of their economic consequences. We will continue to monitor the US response to this EU offer and how these discussions progress, as the outcome will have far-reaching effects on international commerce. Please make sure to watch this video until the end, as we'll be drawing some important conclusions from all these developments. Now, shifting our focus domestically, the Federal Reserve is another central piece of this economic puzzle. There's significant buzz surrounding the Fed today, primarily because they are scheduled to hold a closed-door board meeting. This immediately fuels speculation, especially with persistent rumors of a potential emergency rate cut. While an emergency cut is still considered unlikely by many market analysts, and we'll delve into the current odds shortly, the very possibility hangs in the air, influencing market sentiment. The pressure on the Fed to lower interest rates has been mounting, notably amplified by figures like Donald Trump. Through various statements and social media posts, Trump has been intensely emphasizing the critical need for interest rate cuts. He argues that current rates are stifling economic growth and putting the US at a disadvantage. Many observers believe this vocal pressure is a major contributing factor to the broader economic uncertainty and perhaps even influences the timing and nature of international trade negotiations, like the EU tariff offer we just discussed. The argument is that if the US economy is perceived as potentially weakening or needing stimulus via rate cuts, other countries might adjust their negotiating stances. The Fed's mandate, officially, is to manage inflation and maintain maximum employment, but political pressure and global economic conditions inevitably play a role in their deliberations. This closed-door meeting today, therefore, is under intense scrutiny. What will be discussed? Will hints emerge about future policy direction? While the official purpose might be routine, the context makes it anything but. We must consider the data the Fed is analyzing. Recent inflation figures have shown some moderation, with metrics like trueflation indicating a potential cooling, measured at around 1.1% recently, marking a 4.5-year low according to some reports. However, the upcoming Consumer Price Index, CPI data, expected around April 10th, will be a crucial indicator. There have been concerns about the accuracy and representation of inflation numbers, particularly since the Trump administration, with debates on whether the reported figures truly reflect the cost pressures faced by consumers and businesses. Despite some claims of falling inflation, the stickiness of certain components and the overall cost of living remain major concerns for the average American, and consequently, for policymakers at the Fed. The Fed finds itself in a delicate balancing act: cut rates too soon and risk reigniting inflation, wait too long and potentially exacerbate an economic slowdown or even trigger a recession. The strategy behind all these economic maneuvers, particularly the tariff discussions and the pressure on the Fed, seems multifaceted. If we try to connect the dots, one perspective is that the imposition and subsequent negotiation of tariffs are part of a larger strategic play aimed squarely at influencing the Federal Reserve's monetary policy. Donald Trump has consistently advocated for lower interest rates, believing they are key to boosting the U.S. economy, especially manufacturing. By creating trade friction and uncertainty through tariffs, the argument goes, it might indirectly pressure the Fed to adopt a more accommodative stance to counteract any negative economic fallout. Lowering the cost of borrowing through rate cuts could stimulate investment and consumption, aligning with Trump's economic goals. The tweets highlighting falling oil prices, stable food prices, and low inflation serve to build a case that the conditions are ripe for the Fed to act without risking an inflationary surge. He frames the situation as one where the slow-moving Fed is unnecessarily holding back the economy. Furthermore, the narrative suggests that the U.S. is being abused by other countries through unfair trade practices, bringing in billions from these tariffs while simultaneously pushing for domestic economic relief via lower rates. This creates a dual pressure point: international trade leverage and domestic monetary policy influence. The ultimate prize, from this viewpoint, is forcing the Fed's hand to cut interest rates significantly and early, ideally within the first part of a potential second term for Trump, setting the stage for robust economic growth as he defines it. This strategy intertwines trade policy explicitly with monetary policy objectives, using tariffs not just as tools for trade balance correction, but as levers to achieve desired domestic economic conditions, specifically lower borrowing costs. Whether this complex strategy will succeed or backfire remains a central question, heavily dependent on the Fed's independence, its interpretation of economic data, and the reactions of global trading partners like the EU. Let's delve deeper into the European Union's position and the intricacies beyond just the tariffs themselves. While the offer to discuss zero-for-zero tariffs on industrial goods is a significant headline, it's crucial to understand the nuances of EU trade practices. The EU often relies on mechanisms other than direct tariffs, most notably value-added taxes, VATs. When goods are imported into the EU, a VAT is typically levied. This tax, paid by the European company purchasing the product, functions similarly to a tariff by increasing the cost of imported goods, thus favoring domestic products. While not technically a tariff under standard trade definitions, its economic effect can be comparable. Therefore, a simple zero-for-zero tariff agreement might not fully level the playing field if substantial VATs remain on U.S. goods entering the EU market. Furthermore, the EU is known for its extensive regulatory environment. Standards related to environmental protection, labor, and product safety, while often implemented with valid intentions, can also act as non-tariff barriers. These regulations can make it more difficult and costly for U.S. producers, particularly in sectors like agriculture, to comply and compete effectively in European markets. U.S. farmers, for instance, often find their products deemed uncompetitive, not just due to direct costs, but because of stringent EU regulations that differ significantly from US standards. Consequently, any meaningful trade negotiation between the US and the EU would need to address these regulatory differences and the application of VATs, not just the stated tariff rates. The EU stating they are ready to discuss zero-for-zero tariffs is perhaps an opening gambit. They might be willing to concede on direct industrial tariffs, which they were likely prepared to fight with reciprocal measures anyway, in exchange for maintaining their VAT system or regulatory standards. Trump's negotiators would likely push for concessions on these fronts as well, understanding that true market access requires addressing the full spectrum of trade barriers. The quick turnaround from threatening retaliation to offering negotiation suggests the EU is keenly aware of the potential economic impact of escalating trade disputes and might prefer a negotiated outcome, but one that still protects its internal market structures and regulatory frameworks. The complexity lies in finding a balance that both sides can perceive as fair and beneficial, going beyond the simple elimination of industrial tariffs. Considering the broader global context, the push and pull over tariffs and interest rates reflect a desire, particularly emphasized by the Trump camp, to reshore manufacturing and reduce reliance on foreign production, especially from China. The goal is to revitalize American industry and create domestic jobs. Tariffs are presented as a tool to achieve this by making imported goods more expensive, thereby encouraging consumers and businesses to buy American-made products. However, this strategy is fraught with complexities. While tariffs might protect certain domestic industries, they also raise costs for consumers and for other U.S. businesses that rely on imported components. This can contribute to inflation, directly contradicting the desire for lower interest rates, as the Fed typically raises rates to combat inflation. The economic impact is unevenly distributed, benefiting some sectors while potentially harming others. Moreover, retaliatory tariffs from other countries, as initially expected from the EU and already implemented by China, hurt U.S. exporters, further complicating the economic picture. The argument for bringing manufacturing back also faces the reality of global supply chains, labor costs, and specialized production capabilities developed elsewhere over decades. A significant return of manufacturing to the U.S. would require massive investment, workforce retraining, and time. While tariffs might initiate a shift, they are unlikely to cause a rapid, large-scale relocation of complex manufacturing operations. The interplay with monetary policy is also critical. If tariffs do contribute to inflation, it makes it harder for the Fed to justify rate cuts. Conversely, if the economy slows due to trade friction or other factors, the Fed might be pressured to cut rates, potentially conflicting with its inflation mandate if price pressures persist. Therefore, the strategy involves navigating these conflicting pressures, using tariffs to encourage domestic production while simultaneously managing inflation and pushing for lower interest rates to stimulate growth. It's a high-stakes balancing act with uncertain outcomes, dependent on global reactions, the resilience of the U.S. economy, and the independent decisions of the Federal Reserve. The speculation surrounding the Federal Reserve's actions and the potential for an emergency rate cut deserves closer examination, especially in light of market predictions and recent inflation data. While the polymarket odds for an emergency rate cut in 2025 might currently stand at around 24%, having fluctuated, the probability of any rate cut in the near term is viewed differently. Looking at the odds for the Fed's upcoming meetings, the May 7th meeting shows a high probability, around 72%, of no change in rates. However, moving to the June meeting, the odds shift significantly, with predictions favoring a decrease, predominantly a 25 basis point cut, around 55 to 56% chance, while the likelihood of no change drops to about 34%. By July, the expectation for a rate cut becomes even stronger. This suggests that while an immediate emergency cut might be unlikely barring a severe, unforeseen shock, the market is increasingly pricing in rate cuts starting mid-year. This aligns with the idea that inflation, while perhaps sticky, is generally trending downwards, or that concerns about economic growth are becoming more prominent. The truflation metric showing a significant drop to 1.1%, a multi-year low, supports the disinflation narrative. However, official figures like CPI and PCE are watched more closely by the Fed. If the April 10th CPI report confirms a continued easing of price pressures, it strengthens the case for the Fed to begin cutting rates in June or July. The narrative that Trump is trying to force the Fed's hand via tariff pressure or public statements adds another layer. While the Fed maintains its independence, persistent political pressure combined with moderating inflation and potentially slowing growth could create an environment where rate cuts become the path of least resistance. The closed-door meeting today might offer clues, but the real decisions will hinge on the incoming economic data over the next few months. The overall strategy seems to be banking on inflation continuing to fall, allowing the Fed justification to lower rates, which would then be touted as a major economic win, regardless of whether the tariffs themselves were the primary driver of the disinflation or simply a coincident factor in a complex global economic environment. So, what are the key takeaways from this intricate web of economic news and political maneuvering? We're witnessing a complex interplay between trade policy, monetary policy, and political objectives. First, the tariff situation remains highly fluid. The EU's offer of 0 for 0 on industrial goods represents a potential de-escalation, but needs to be viewed within the context of other trade barriers like VATs and regulations. Negotiations will be intricate, and the outcome is far from certain. The U.S. push, particularly under Trump's influence, involves using tariffs as leverage, not just for trade balance, but potentially to influence domestic monetary policy. Second, the Federal Reserve is under immense pressure. While an emergency rate cut seems improbable right now, market expectations are building for cuts starting mid-year, likely in June or July. This is predicated on inflation continuing its downward trend, which upcoming data releases will either confirm or challenge. The Fed's decisions will be critical, balancing the risks of reigniting inflation against supporting economic growth amidst global uncertainties and political pressure. Third, the overarching goal of reshoring manufacturing and achieving robust domestic growth is a central theme, but the effectiveness and consequences of using tariffs to achieve this are debatable and complex. It impacts consumers, different industries, international relations, and inflation itself. Fourth, Donald Trump's rhetoric and actions continue to be a significant factor, aiming to shape both trade negotiations and Fed policy to align with his economic vision, focusing heavily on securing lower interest rates. Finally, uncertainty prevails. Predicting the exact sequence of events, tariff resolutions, Fed actions, economic growth trajectory, is incredibly difficult. We are likely in for a period of continued negotiation, speculation, and market volatility as these major economic forces interact. The strategy of using tariffs to force rate cuts while managing inflation is a high-wire act, and its success depends on a multitude of factors, many outside of direct control. It requires careful monitoring of economic indicators, central bank communications, and geopolitical developments in the coming weeks and months. That's our analysis for today. There's clearly a lot going on, and the situation is evolving rapidly. We'll keep tracking these developments and bring you updates as they happen. Remember to like, subscribe, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching.